Underthings really matter in historical clothing. It's kind of the foundation for the entire look. Can you imagine an 1890s ensemble without a corset? Even chemises fill out the neckline for a lot of eras. Personally, I like to start my ensembles from the skin out so that I know I'm setting myself up for success down the road. However, I have come to that point in my current project where I inevitably ask myself, does from the skin out really include stockings? I mean, stockings don't affect the silhouette at all. Nobody ever sees them. They're kind of the same throughout history, so one pair of stockings is much like another. I've already hand sewn several pairs of stockings. Do I really need to? Gross. Got my 21st century silly socks. I've got my 16th century research. Let's make some Italian Renaissance silly stockings. This is obviously supposed to be a silly, purely funsies project, not meant to be historically accurate at all. Believe it or not, there is actually some historical justification for silly stockings. Plus, I just genuinely enjoy trying to figure out historical techniques. So let's look at some late 16th, early 17th century stockings and see what we can use in this much more absurd pair that I'm making. Hey, it's Italian Renaissance silly socks. JK, it's 17th century boot hose, but close enough. The ensemble I'm making is 1507 to 1508-ish, but the basic engineering of stockings didn't change that much. Plus, this is only historically tangential at this point, so who cares? My 21st century silly socks are knit, of course. They also have elastic plated to the inside, so they are springy. Historical stockings are not springy. Prior to the invention of the knitting machine in the mid-16th century, and actually well into the 18th century for that matter, stockings were cut from woven cloth on the bias or the diagonal grain, which gave them some stretch, not a lot. Anyway, back to these cuffs. We have birds, we have all sorts of flora, we have decorative scroll work, and gilded lace. I want my silly stockings to be a cross between this and this. Obviously not this fine or skilled, but something in the way of. I could obviously paint or draw an all-over print onto my fabric, or, you know, buy printed fabric. But I rather like the idea of taking the ornateness of this and translating it into a more modern all-over print like this. Plus, I like overcomplicating things, so here we are. I do technically have a pattern for stockings that I've used previously, but why not? Let's make another. I mean, this is a totally intuitive, straightforward pattern to draft, right? Feet and legs are strange. They're shaped strangely. You have to get this big heel through the little ankle tunnel without elastic. So there's some interesting engineering at play here. To likely ruin that engineering, I will be tracing this from the book and then using it as a guide to take my own measurements. I'm then going to use the shape from the book along with my own measurements as a guide to draft a full-scale pattern. I know, pattern drafting on this channel. Gasp, right? But sometimes you gotta. I'm going to use this pattern as is. I will obviously be making at least one mock-up. The only thing I'm really changing is this cuff is bodacious. I mean, it's meant to fold over a boot. So I'll have a much smaller cuff that will be used to cover up the garters or ribbons that will be tied at the top here to hold the stocking up on my leg because, again, no elastic. Okay, let's go. There was no great way to film the pattern drafting process, so enjoyed this not at all to scale dramatic reenactment. The measurements needed are the length from the tips of the toes to wherever the stocking is going to come up to on the leg, and the center of the bottom of the heel to the same place, which needs to be marked along the first measurement. The circumference of the calf, wherever the stocking is going to end on the leg, the meat or widest part of the calf, the ankle, the width of the foot, and the length between all of these points. The clocked area is notoriously difficult to draft, so I drafted the foot portion of the sole and left a generous rectangle of fabric on the mock-up to drape the clocked area. On the mock-up, I connected the foot portion, slit the leg as long as I needed to just barely fit my heel through the ankle tunnel, And while my foot was in ankle tunnel limbo, I stuffed the rectangle of fabric up behind the slit and marked out how much extra fabric was needed. I then marked that on the muslin and transferred the pattern to brown paper. All of my previous stockings have been wool, but all of the extant stockings in POF4 are linen, and I had this remnant from a previous project, which is a linen cotton blend. I spent an embarrassingly long time deciding what kind of motif I wanted for these stockings. I finally decided, as an homage to my primary reference portrait for the overarching project, to feature bunnies. I doodled some simplified versions of bunnies, and I think with their iconic ears they are recognizable enough even from a distance. Historically, the stocking pattern would be drawn onto the fabric in ink or chalk, and the entire fabric panel would be laced onto an embroidery frame so that the all-over embroidery could be worked prior to cutting out the stocking. However, this remnant is an odd shape and wouldn't be suitable for lacing onto the embroidery frame that I also don't own. So I used this comically small embroidery hoop, which may actually be for ants. I wanted to use some of the techniques from the extant stockings, which include couched gold work, satin fill stitches, French knots, and stem stitch. Most of the line work in the extant embroidery is achieved with couched gold work, that is gold-wrapped silk thread that is held to the face of the fabric with passing threads. To mimic this, I outlined each motif with a couched golden cord. Mine is a bit more coarse, but I think it worked well regardless. The motifs in the original are filled with reeled silk, which is silk thread that hasn't been twisted, and how you get these super smooth, shiny fills. I am using good old readily available DMC cotton embroidery floss. I found the full 6 strands worked well for this project. The motifs in the original are small enough that a simple satin stitch, or a stitch that passes back and forth across the entire front and back of the fill space, is all that's needed to fill the desired areas. Mine have a greater space to be filled, so I used a staggered satin stitch, which allowed me to use multiple stitches to span the fill space. Again, more coarse than the original, but again, these are meant to be historically inspired, mostly cute and modern, so it's fine, again. Embroidery is one of those things, like snowboarding, that I'm not great at, but I just love so much that I hope what I lack in natural or cultivated skill I make up for in enthusiasm. That being said, my embroidery, at least, gets better with each project. In fact, it improved so much by the end of this project that I went back and fixed some of the more unfortunate early bunnies. I wanted the cuffs to pay homage to 16th century embroidery, but to mostly be modern and cute. There's one stocking embroidered. I realized as I was getting ready to doodle up a second stocking's worth of bunnies that I was definitely over embroidering bunnies. I don't know about you all, but I personally like to mix and match my silly socks, so after all, is there a more classic pairing than bunnies and donuts? In all seriousness though, I actually have celiac and I have yet to find a decent yeasted donut that's gluten-free. So there is definitely some unsubtle wish fulfillment happening here. Okay, so I've just realized that I was so careful with this border. I did it on the opposite side so that when I turned over the cuff, it would be on the right side with this embroidery, but I did it upside down. I mean, it could be right side up because who says that a strawberry has to be pointing downward? This stuff definitely, it's obviously supposed to be like growing from the bottom up and not from the top down. Okay, it's not the end of the world. It's a little bit long anyway, so I'm just gonna cut it off and seam it on, I guess. Yeah, it just goes to show you that no matter how carefully you plan something out, it's always gonna be a problem in the end. Tears in my eyes, I cut the band from the stocking about halfway between the band and the body so that the join will be hidden by the cuff. I compensated for the seam allowance by adding the length to the top of the band, since that will be the part that is connected to the body now. After double and triple checking the orientation, I restitched the band to the body with a running back stitch and felled the inside of the stitch. One great thing about pairs is that if you mess up on the first piece, you can make it look intentional by doubling down on the second piece. Still not over embroidering the first cuff upside down, but at least both stockings will have cut and sewn cuffs. Actually, after looking more closely at the originals, it looks like their cuffs are cut and sewn too. I've read that embroidery like this could be done in panels or bands so that it could be moved around from garment to garment. So maybe I didn't mess up the embroidery. Maybe I was being historically accurate. Despite the intimidating clocked area, these are pretty simple to construct as long as you put them together in the right order. I started by lining the bottom of the foot to the top of the foot, and I began backstitching the wrong side of the fabric at the center of the toe. I backstitched up the side of the foot and to the top of the ankle gusset. Looking back at this now, these stitches are a bit large. This area will see a lot of strain, so this is not the place to save time with a loose stitch. When coming down the other leg of the gusset, I found it simpler and neater to do a tiny whip stitch from the right side of the fabric. I came back almost to the heel, but not quite, since the heel will need to be stitched and felled before sewing a seam across it. I then felled the inside of the stitch to make sure this area will be as reinforced as possible. Next, I stitched the back seam in the exact same way. Okay, so for the tops of these, I decided that we need to be extra and to add the lace. Last time, I promise. So here is that lace that's at the top here. Lace like this is found a lot more in the latter half of the 16th century, so not in keeping with the time period of the rest of the ensemble that I'm making, but they're like stupid Renaissance socks, so of course I'm going to make them extra. I played materials chicken with Joann's. They just so happen to have some pretty convincing historical trims there. I found these three. There's this one, which, you know, is like similar to some historical laces. There's this one. Looks like the person who designed this has actually seen 17th century lace. I mean, way to go, Joanne. And then I got this one, which is probably the least historical of all three. This one's obviously my favorite because it's just the most historically inspired, I think. It covers up the bunny, so I'm probably not going to be using this one, even though I feel like it's sensational. I really like this one, probably the closest in scale to the one in the book. Honestly, I'll probably use this one. It's going to be a little bit higher, so I think it'll like just graze the top of the bunny, which is kind of cute. Yeah, that's what I'm doing next, and that's going to be sort of like the finishing touch to these stockings. Some nice historically inspired lace. So, yes. I sewed the mid-sized lace to the bunny's right sides together using a simple running back stitch. No need to use a full back stitch, this won't see any strain. Turned the lace to face outwards, and prick stitched the edge of the lace to the inside, covering the raw edge of the stocking. The donuts got the appropriately rounded lace. From start to end, this project was ridiculous and I loved it. This was a good firm reminder that while I do take historical dress and research seriously, there is always room for fun and joy. In fact, I think all of my historical stockings need to be silly stockings from now on. And that is about all I have to say on the matter. If you enjoyed this absurdity, feel free to leave a thumbs up and tell me about one of your Just for Funsies projects. If you care to join along in further historical and not so historical adventures, hit subscribe. I upload almost monthly. See ya!